The most legendary sword both in fiction and in real-world history is also one of the most misunderstood armaments of our time. I am of course talking about the katana, a sword that is an iconic part of Japanese culture and history, romanticized as connected spiritually with its wielder and full of misconceptions when it comes to its appearance in cinema, anime, and video games. On this episode of Loadout, we take a look at some of the misconceptions that surround the sharpened steel of the samurai and talk to the Royal Armoury's curator of Oriental Collections, Natasha Bennett, so we can better understand the myths and legends that surround the katana. The first thing that anyone thinks about when it comes to the katana is the almost absurd level of sharpness that this sword has. We're often shown it being able to make clean cuts through anything and anyone, in some cases with such speed and finesse that the object doesn't fall apart until many seconds later.
I think it's hyped up and oversimplified quite a lot on certain occasions. Yes, there's this idea that a katana can put through anything from a rock to a piece of silk thrown into the air. We do have a sword in the Armoury's collection that is reputed to have cut through a block of stone and survived without even a chip. They are lethal cutting weapons.
But one of the most common misconceptions that surround Japanese swords as a whole is that every sword was a katana, no matter the shape, length, or use. Whereas in reality, the katana was just one razor-sharp part of the samurai's or ashigaru's arsenal.
A katana is only one type of sword. The technology and the basic underlying principles of construction within Japanese swords as a whole, that doesn't really change over the course of an entire millennium. Within that, the swords do develop, and this is all due to the change in taste and also, crucially, alterations in fighting approaches and the way that battles are conducted.
The katana took over from the tachi and became more popular as the combat was switching from individual cavalry skirmishes to close-up battles on foot with multiple opponents.
Before the Mongol invasions, the sword tended on the whole to be a secondary weapon. Most combat was undertaken on an individual basis, at least in the first instance. Once the Mongolian invasion happened, the Japanese had quite a nasty shock because the Mongols didn't adhere to any of these fighting tactics. They fought in large groups, mostly on foot. They used short, very, very powerful bows, and very importantly, they had spears. The Japanese forces learnt from this. The ashigaru, the foot soldiers, they needed a sword that was shorter, easier to wield on foot. So as a result of all these factors, the katana developed into this ideal sword.
The quicker draw of the sword was well suited to the more intimate confrontations, where victory was decided by speed and reaction time. The new style of sword also meant that swordsmen could, in theory, draw their blade and strike the enemy with one fluid motion, as the sharpened edge of the blade was worn facing up, whereas previously the tachi had been worn with the blade facing down. Swords were also not the first weapon to be called upon in a battle. Instead, samurai and ashigaru would use yumi bows, spears, and glaives before engaging one-on-one with their sidearm swords, shouting challenges to their opponents. The element of shouting challenges and reciting exploits of your bloodline is something we've seen a lot of in pop culture, and even as a gameplay mechanic that is represented in Ghost of Tsushima, which allows you to challenge a group of Mongols or Straw Hat Ronin as you approach the field of battle, an aspect that other games in the genre also touch upon.
My name is Kyawu Masataka Oniwa!
This is one of the many elements that feeds into the image of honorable duels using the katana and Japanese sword fighting in general.
The whole reasoning behind engaging in an individual way was to ensure that you were of a similar social strata to your opponent. If they were below you, they weren't worthy of fighting. The Mongols just completely floored them. They just weren't ready to take on an enemy that had a very utilitarian, shall we say, approach to fighting, and they weren't used to these large bodies of men who were able to keep their horses at bay. Within that context, fighting one-on-one with a sword will have had similar connotations.
Another element that surrounds the discussion of the katana is its metallurgical makeup. Debates old and new have pit European swords against Asian weapons. Arguments often encompass the pros and cons of differing forging techniques, as well as claims that Japan had worse iron in relation to the rest of the world, and are often invoked when the katana is compared to other swords from across the world.
The steel is extracted from an iron ore that's kind of sluiced out of riverbeds. The raw metal that comes out of that is very high quality. This was then smelted to produce the swordsmith's main starting material, which is known as tamahagani. The pieces of tamahagani would be piled on an iron plate, wrapped in wet paper, coated in a kind of slurry, and then heated to welding temperature. The smith is aided in hammering out this block of metal, which then famously is folded, welded, and then rehammered, usually about 15 to 20 times. The effect of this is to remove kind of the impurities in the metal. The outcome is to make sure the finished sword blade has a section of steel that is high carbon, forming the cutting edge and the point, and then steel that is low carbon and softer, forming the main body of the blade. The blade's hammered out into the shape with regular reheatings to allow it to be worked. The next famous stage is that it's coated in clay. The areas of the blade that are intended to be kept soft, they have a thicker coating of clay, and the cutting edge has a much thinner coating. And the result of this is that when the blade is then reheated and it's then quenched very quickly in a horizontal bath of water, the cutting edge cools much faster because it's got this thinner coating of clay. It contracts to become very, very hard, whereas the softer area cools more slowly. So it remains relatively flexible and durable. After this, you've got that instantly recognisable curved blade, and this would then be polished. It's a really painstaking process, and it reveals the beautiful grain in the steel that comes about as part of the manufacturing process.
Both due to the creation and care that these blades have received during the centuries that they've been forged, katanas from the feudal period of Japan are still lethal cutting weapons years later. While European swords were found in battlefields or discarded in bogs and mud, many of the most legendary Japanese swords were handed down from generation to generation, and almost always received an unprecedented level of care and attention. This level of care means we can still see the lethality of blades that were hammered and folded so long ago. One of the reasons the katana has such a legendary status and has also received such a high level of care and safekeeping was that the sword was also a status symbol, with long periods of Japanese history where only the ruling samurai class were able to proudly wear longswords. One of these periods was during the rule of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who called a great sword hunt in 1588 and forbade any of the Japanese peasantry to own or wear a weapon. The famous samurai, however, were exempt from this ruling.
One of the reasons that the sword is so legendary is that it was intrinsic to the identity and the status of samurai. It was absolutely fundamental to their identity and their position and the recognition of their role in society. A good sword is very much a status symbol, so if you can afford it and if your ranking is senior enough, then yes, you would have a good quality blade if you hadn't inherited one already that was centuries old by that point.
Swordsmiths were, and still are, regarded as artists, one of the most famous being Goro Nyodo Masamune, who died in 1343 but is still regarded as Japan's greatest swordsmith. One of his most famous blades is the Honjo Masamune, which represented the Tokugawa shogunate during most of the Edo period and was passed from shogun to shogun as rulers came and went. However, it has unfortunately been missing since the American occupation of Japan. The production of Japanese swords was banned by US forces, and due to this, the apparent last sighting of this legendary sword was at a police station in December 1945. The hunt for this sword still continues to this day. While the Masamune is regarded as a lost national treasure, there are also wilder stories that surround a number of swords, with them often being called cursed or bloodthirsty. Considering that during the Sengoku period, widespread lawlessness led to samurai committing violence and murder against the civilian populace, even using random unarmed civilians to test out the sharpness of their swords, a practice known as tsutsuguri, or crossroads killing. This is certainly at odds with the ideal of an honourable samurai that we see in much modern media.
Within Japan, swords are greatly admired as art objects. They command a great deal of respect for the exquisite craftsmanship that they still display, and the massive cultural significance that they embody. It even goes as far as a number of living swordsmiths, currently practicing swordsmiths, are regarded as living national treasures due to the vital role that they're perceived as playing in preserving the cultural heritage of Japan. The fact that the Japanese sword is so popular and it's so instantly recognised shows that there's this enduring appeal on multiple levels. So it's brought in many different ways, and as a result the Japanese sword has remained very, very relevant. But sometimes I think it can come across as quite sensationalised, and I think ultimately that sometimes it risks diminishing the quite nuanced role of the Japanese sword, but both as a historical weapon and as a really important cultural symbol.
With this reputation and reverence in mind, it only makes sense that in the realms of pop culture they exist on such a huge spectrum. From the reserved depictions in classic Kurosawa films, to the over-the-top sword clashes of anime, to games like Nioh, Sekiro and Ghost of Tsushima, which all run the gamut. Ghost of Tsushima is an interesting one, as it aims to pay homage to aspects of Japanese culture of the time. But while it takes some liberties with its setting, its themes can also be interpreted as being emblematic to how the samurai changed during the era, and especially how the katana was respected and wielded. The weapons and armor of the samurai class were incredibly respected by their wielders, but also their families and clans. And this respect carries over in some of the media we see today, as well as being echoed in real life.
The katana on Japanese swords in general loom pretty large in the realms of popular culture. The most popular idea that you probably hear people quoting is that the Japanese sword is the soul of the samurai. They're passed down through generation after generation of a family, or they're given to shrines for safekeeping. So they're still pristine and magnificent at the current time. So that their reputation is kind of condensed as a result of that. Popularly regarded as the best cutting weapon ever, the most perfectly formed cutting weapon ever. There's accounts of skilled samurai cleaving opponents' heads in two through a helmet. These weapons were absolutely lethal, particularly if they were in the hands of trained swordsmen.
Now, I'll be the first to admit that the process of interviewing and researching for this episode of Loadout challenged a lot of what I thought I knew about the katana. There were things about its strengths and weaknesses, forging, techniques, and usage that I thought I knew, but there was also so much more that I learned along the way, and I hope that goes for you too, watching at home. But does this sword of such legendary repute deserve the incredible regard that it still has today? Do movies, anime, and games pay it a respectful homage, and how much of it is exaggerated?
Even though there are so many legends and exaggerated stories, a lot of those are probably based in reality to some extent. I don't think there's smoke without a fire. Where the Japanese sword's concerned, and the katana is part of that. If you look at the vast number of exquisite examples that are preserved in shrines and temples and museums and private collections in Japan and across the rest of the world, they're still absolutely incredible objects to look at. And to have something that pristine that has lasted in peak condition from when it was first made in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, it demonstrates that these swords show an absolute pinnacle of craftsmanship that was so enduring. It shows the respect that they've been held in within their society. They're revered. Now they're an iconic and instantly recognisable motif of popular culture, and I think that's happened for a very good reason. There's a lot of foundation there to suggest that its image and reputation is highly justified.
So that about does it for this slice of content, but I want to know if what you heard here today taught you anything new or challenged any of the beliefs that you previously held about the katana. We'll have a future video looking at the katana's use in games coming very soon, but I don't want to give too much away about that just yet. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. Like the video if indeed you did, and if you want to talk about the coolest swords in our pop culture, you can hit me up on Twitter @IrregularDave, or leave your thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.